Welcome to the KIX EAP Podcast, your monthly podcast with important leaders in education from Eastern Europe, Middle East and North Africa, Central Asia, and the Asia Pacific. I'm your host, Ryan Allen, assistant professor at Soka University of America here in Orange County, California. My own background is in international and comparative education. Let's start the show. Today we have Kim Anh Nguyen, the national coordinator of the Vietnam Association for Education for All. We talk about how she got into the field of education from a somewhat unique path, along with the challenges of coalition building across different organizations and her work with students with disabilities in Vietnam. Really important work. Let's start the show. Well, thank you for joining me on the show today. I'm excited to have you on. Can you maybe talk a little bit about your educational experience? You have a degree from Foreign Trade University there in Hanoi, but then you also have an international master's degree in international studies from the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. So can you maybe just talk about your educational background and kind of what led you to your educational interest and especially going abroad?
Thank you very much, Ryan, for having me. About my educational background. Yes, I think graduating high school and going to university, I think I like to do something in international relations. So that's why I study foreign trade and also international relations as well. And after that, I went to work for a tiger beer company. It's a tiger beer sole distributor in the north of Vietnam. And there I got to know the work of some organizations, some charity organizations and NGOs as well. That's why I know a little bit about their work. And after that, I took a course, a short course on office secretary, because I think I want to improve my career as an office secretary as my first job. And in that short training, the company was connected to some NGOs who they also source staff from that training courses. And I was introduced to work for the Vietnam Children's Fund. It's an American NGO that works in Vietnam, working on building elementary school in Vietnam. And as soon as I moved to work for that NGO, I realized that this is my work, like this is me doing things. So I've been working for NGOs, for Vietnam Children's Fund, and then in 2000, I think, I started working for Oxfam in Vietnam. And I work in a joint Oxfam program on anti-human trafficking. I really enjoyed the worked there for 7 years. And when the program phased out, I think this is the time that I need to improve my education. Like I've been working in development, but I've never been really study about development. All what I learned is from the work from my colleagues. But really now this is the time for me to really study about it, learn about it. So that's why I applied for that international master on development study at the Graduate Institute on International Development and International Studies.
Wow, I love the story. You were working for a beer company and you were looking at being maybe a secretary, and suddenly you find education and you work your way into these amazing organizations, and now you're doing such amazing work with Vietnam Association for Education for All. So can you talk a little bit about that organization and your work as the national coordinator?
So maybe before joining that organization, started back a little bit after the course, after the master course. Because before that, I was working in migrations and anti-human trafficking. And I was very passionate about that subject. I really enjoyed my work. But still, there are so much challenges, so many things that sometimes we find like we cannot think of a solution, how to solve this. All these problems relates to migrations and human trafficking. So after that master course, I really think that education will be core in dealing with many development issues. And I think after the course, I want to work in an organization that really focus on education. That was my plan. And the original plan is maybe I work there for 1 to 2 years it was also the advice from the social work advisor in our team when I work in anti-human trafficking, because we've been working in the subject for quite a long time, myself and other team members. And sometimes we, from like hearing from the social workers, like what we've been through, what we've heard, what we were working on, and they also say that it's good, like you pause for a while, and if you're still in love with the issue, you can come back. So that's why I really target organizations that work on education after the course. And then, so at that time, the association hasn't been like fully established. It was at the very beginning step of the organizations, and a group of international NGOs, ActionAid, Oxfam, Plan in Vietnam, World Vision, etc. They come together to support the establishment of the coalitions. And they were looking for a coordinator who started the independent process for this organization. So that was when I joined the organization in 2011. And I was there at the beginning. The task is to establish, to make the organization to be independent from the host INGOs, and to confirm on the visions, the plan, the strategy for the organizations. So back then in 2011, and it's a long process. Only until 2015, we was able to get the formal legal registrations for the associations. But the activity has been going on since 2009 and since 2011 when I joined. So the associations is a network of, up to now, we have 50 members organizations, and also some individual, one member. And the organizations are either local NGOs, community-based organizations, some clubs, some marginalized group, also some research institute, some schools, and some individuals. So today we have 50 members, and soon we will have an annual meeting this year, and we'll have 5 more new members. All the members are working either on women's issues, children's issues, ethnic minority, persons with disability, LGBTQI. So those are the works of the members.
I love, again, this idea of bringing together these organizations. But I know it can also be kind of a challenge to do that, because different organizations have different goals and sort of maybe different values. So can you talk about your experience of bringing in these different organizations, some of them international, some of them local, even individual researchers and things like that, and like, what are kind of the challenges in that? And have you had any successful strategies to sort of manage that?
Yeah, you are very right. It's really challenging to coordinate a network, a group of so many organizations with different expectations, different priority, different people. That's very true. And when the main purpose of all the organizations and this network, when they come together, is to strengthen the voice of the civil society organizations in advocating for policies of for the expansions of the good practice that they've been experienced in the field. So that's why they come together. So I think the main thing when we work in coordinating the network or developing the network is to really focus on what is the main purpose when organizations and people comes together. And I think key thing is we need to ensure that there are mechanisms and processes internally to facilitate the participations, the democratic process, the transparency of the organizations. Because once people see the unfairness or the then conflicts can happen. Like usually in a network, there will always be conflicts. But then if we really have the mechanism, the process to deal with it, then the thing that keep everybody together and keep everybody going. So from things like, for example, fundraising, we need to be very mindful of, because the association is one organization and we can do our own fundraising. So we have to make sure that fundraising activity of the associations will not conflict or will not compete with the fundraisings of the members. So for example, many times even our board because we are network, so we are elect the steering board of the association. Sometimes even board member questioning like why we don't pursue this call for applications of funding, etc. But then we always have to go back to, is it conflict with the members? Is it competing with the members' fundraising activity? Because funding is so scarce for NGO, for CSO already. I think that's one thing about the internal process, but about the program work also. I think to really keep the network together, the priority, the strategies, or the issues that we choose to focus on to advocate, because there are so many issues and members work on so many diverse fields and issues. So what will be the prioritized one that you want the focus of the whole associations, and the association can help bring it up to policymakers, to decision-making level, for example. So that thing had to come organically from the participations of the member. So listening to the member, do a proper consultations with members, I think is also very important.
Yeah, fantastic. In my leadership classes that I teach with my students, this would be a perfect example of how to keep sort of the organization together. So I do appreciate that. I have a question about maybe those individual, the focuses that you were kind of talking about. You specifically have work maybe with inclusive education in Vietnam, especially with students with disabilities. So can you maybe talk about like what does that work look like in Vietnamese schools, and especially I know you've worked with students who might have hearing impairment. Can you maybe talk a little bit about your work in that space?
Thank you very much for the questions on that, because it's really the focus of the associations. It's really the most prioritized issues identified by our member. Though we also prioritize like adult education, non-formal educations, and also early childhood education from under 3 years old. But improving inclusion in education is one of the core things that we focus on, because we think it's still a big gap in Vietnam and also in many other countries in the region, as we join a regional network as well. So in our member network, we have different organizations working with students with disability or persons with disability in general, but we have a big group of members who are organizations of the deaf, who work on deaf issues in general. Also, we have 4 schools for deaf in our member networks. So that's really the focus area. Because in inclusive education now, we think there are still a lot of misunderstanding, misinterpreting of the concept of what is inclusion in education or what is inclusive education. Usually people will very quickly think of when student with disability mixed with the student without disability, then it's a kind of inclusion. And if you have separate classroom for them, or you have a classroom inside school but separately for students with disabilities, then that is not really an inclusion. But I think that kind of very easy illustration or simple illustrations to make people understand the issues easily, that it leads to misunderstanding in reality, in implementations. So I think it also creates additional difficulties and challenges for students with disability. I think many governments are now under pressures of international community on heading towards inclusive education. So for different special need groups, but specifically also for students with disabilities. And under that pressures, and they may take actions, and without proper understanding of the issues, it may lead to misunderstanding or misconducting in implementations. And it may create to the situations where students with disabilities suffer. And especially for the deaf, because we are working with the deaf communities and deaf school, etc. And we find that in working in inclusive education, we have to address it as a whole when it comes to policy, etc. But in implementations, because each disability are so different, the needs will be different. So we need to be also very specific. So that's why the whole membership say we need to prioritize in deaf education and really dig deep into it and bring the issues up. For example, for deaf, because they are not using the audio language, Their language is sign language. And because there are a group of deaf who it's hard of hearing, what we call, because for my association, deaf is the communities that when they communicate in sign language, that will be the most comfortable channel, or the channels that they will understand the most, and they find themselves there. It's their natural language. And for other group of hard of hearing, maybe they can wear hearing aids or cochlear implants, and they can learn to speak. But the deaf doesn't hear, and they don't hear themselves speak, so they don't understand, for example. And in education, implementation of education for them, for example, many even policymakers will think that because at the end, the deaf will have to integrate in the society where with hearing people, and they cannot have a sign language interpreter, for example, with them all the time. So they should learn to read the lips and try to make the sound. So in many schools, that's how they try to do. Like they try to make the deaf speak and read the lips. But for the deaf, it's very difficult. Like it's create all kind of misunderstanding. We have the same shape of mouth for different words, and they don't learn. So we argue that if in education they don't understand, so how can they integrate later on? So usually in many schools in Vietnam, the deaf spend 10 years in elementary. And for many of them, they enter grade 1 very late, and they spend 10 years. So for some of the leaders in organizations of deaf now, they graduate primary when they were 17 years old. But then without the full understanding, they don't really have all the knowledge of elementary. So how can they progress up? So in Vietnam, only until 2000, the year 2000, it was the first time when the deaf in Vietnam have a place to study up to lower secondary and process to high school and go to college level and university level. And because they learned in sign language in that center. And that model is now expanded to one more in the north of Vietnam. The original one was in the south under the support of Nippon Foundation, and now they expand to the north. And now some other small individual deaf schools who really apply sign language methodologies. So that will be very different. So if we talk about inclusive education for the deaf, for example, what are the periods that they need to learn in sign language with their peer before maybe they can join a mixed class, for example? And other things like assistive device for disability inclusive education in general, assistive device, accessibility, method, teacher training, they are all kind of issues. So I think there are still a lot to do in this area in Vietnam and also in many countries in the region and maybe in the world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're still trying to figure it out here in the United States. That's for sure. But it's an incredible endeavor, and I'm excited that you're putting all of this organization's effort and resources into improving these students' lives. I mean, that's just inspiring to hear. Thank you for that. One thing that I heard you mention was to working with policymakers or connecting with policymakers. Can you maybe talk about that relationship, and are they receptive? Do they kind of understand like what you're trying to do in the classrooms or with the students?
So we been trying to build a strong relationships with policymakers, decision makers, and it comes to the point where we understand each other that we're all heading to the same objectives. So that makes it it's easier to work together. Of course, it takes time. And I think you asked earlier about the win. So I think one of the win is
Sure.
We've been able to build good connections with policymakers, decision makers at the Ministry of Education, at the National Institute of Education, Educational Science, where they can provide inputs from the works of our members to policy-making level. So for example, in 2019, it was the first time sign language was mentioned in the revised education law. It was never before that. And we've been working with members advocating when the government revising the education law. And in a article talking about the language and method used in school for ethnic minority, when they talk about language for different ethnic minority in Vietnam, then we were able to mention also the deaf can learn through sign language and the blind can learn through Braille. So we add two of that. So it was really like an encouraging point for us in our advocacy work. And the government because Vietnam have ratified the Convention on the Rights for People with Disability. And in Vietnam is in the process to also improving the civil laws and regulations to comply with that. So it's really the moments for us to work hard on educating, making policy makers to understand what is the real situation on the ground. So there is a steering committee on education for children with disability and children in difficult circumstances. That was the long name for the committee, but it was under Ministry of Education, who are now in charge of developing different policies on education for students with disability. And for example, this year they've been working on a circular on the establishment and operations of inclusive education resource centers in Vietnam. So we are also coming there providing inputs from the work on the ground and also very specific on deaf education, for example, to make sure that policy will support the improvement on the ground or the implementations on the ground. And so far, we've been receiving positive feedback and cooperations from the committee, from the government. I think we've built trust after time. Like it was not there at the beginning because people have different understanding in mind, and yeah. But then I think through time we were able to do that.
Yeah, I mean that's you're right in calling that a win. I mean that's fantastic. You're working with the upper echelon of the government structure to sort of improve these lives on the ground. I that's wonderful to hear. We're kind of coming to the end of the interview, and it's been wonderful so far. But if you could maybe just give us a little final word to our audience. One thing I always ask, and we have international audience around the world. Why is it so important to listen to local experts on the ground? If you can sort of give that message to maybe some of the development community, and how can they sort of better listen or sort of better address your needs?
I think like for your questions, I think identifying who are the experts is also important, because sometimes we think of expert will be professor in the university, but people in the ground is the real expert on their issues. Like, for example, for us, when we work in deaf education, the deaf are the experts. So we always be mindful about having their voice heard, bringing them, make sure that they have space in dialogue, policy consultations spaces. So policymakers, decision makers can hear from them and can understand correctly the issues. So the policy that will sustain with us through time, and many schools, many people will look up to act upon the policies, will also really understand it in the right way. So I think from there, like people on the ground and people who really work with those organizations, with the issues on the ground, have the in-depth understanding of the issues, are the experts. And for example, like us working in the office of the association, for example, we always have to remind ourselves that because we work for a while in the issues and we may have our own assumptions, but we have to be very careful with our assumptions, because it can be not right, it can be wrong. For example, working on the deaf education issues, every day we learn or we realize the new reality. For many years at the beginning, we always have the assumptions that I think now many policy makers still have it, that in deaf school, they use sign language method. Because you don't know the language, you go there and you see some teachers sign and you think they are using sign language methods. But in reality, it was not. Because sign language, they may use sign, but they don't master in sign language, or they don't fluent in the language. So they, for example, if they don't follow the grammar structures of the language, they don't really fully apply the language, then the student also doesn't understand. So things like that, we always remind ourselves.
I again co-sign on that. I love that message of it's not just professors, it's not just policymakers. There's people across the spectrum in different organizations who are doing wonderful work, and that's our mission definitely on this podcast, to include them in the conversations. And Kim Anh, we're delighted to have you today. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. It's also my pleasure.
And this concludes our KIX EAP podcast, which is released every first Wednesday of the month. Of course, the opinions expressed on the KIX EAP podcast are solely those of the host and the guest. The KIX EAP podcast is made possible by KIX, which stands for Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. KIX is an initiative of the Global Partnership for Education. Globally, KIX is administered by the International Development Research Center in Canada. NORAG in Geneva hosts one of the 4 regional hubs of KIX. Find us on the NORAG or GPE KIX websites. You can subscribe to the KIX EAP podcast, newsletter, and webinar series, and also learn about KIX global or regional projects. Additionally, you can subscribe directly on Spotify or SoundCloud to receive notifications of the new monthly podcast. Thanks for listening.